The guard dogs were already barking when Elira slipped over the garden wall, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Behind her, somewhere in the dark trees, a small animal whimpered in pain, a sound so weak it barely carried on the wind. She did not have time to be careful. She did not have time to be afraid. She only had minutes before the pup's breathing stopped for good. She had found him an hour earlier, lying in the mud near the old stone bridge that marked the border of Crimson Fang territory. His side was torn open, his fur matted with blood, and his small body trembled with every breath. Elira had seen dying animals before. She had grown up on the edges of the pack, in the poorest part of the territory, where survival was never guaranteed, and kindness was often seen as weakness. But something about this pup made her stop. Maybe it was the way his eyes found hers in the darkness, pleading, or maybe it was the fact that no one else had bothered to help him. Whatever the reason, she could not walk away. She scooped him into her arms, felt his ribs beneath his fur, and ran. She did not know where she was running to at first, only that she needed to save him. It was an old healer, a woman named Vera, who lived near the market square, who gave her the answer she did not want to hear. "The wound is poisoned," Vera had said, examining the pup by candlelight. "Some kind of blade did this, coated in something meant to kill slowly. I have herbs, but nothing strong enough. The only cure I know of that could stop this poison in time is the royal healing rose. It grows only in the king's garden." Elira's stomach had dropped at those words. The royal garden was the most protected place in the entire kingdom, second only to the throne room itself. Everyone knew the roses inside were guarded not just by soldiers, but by ancient wards placed on the royal bloodline generations ago. Stealing so much as a single petal was considered a crime against the crown itself, punishable by death. Elira was not royalty. She was not even close. She was a low-ranked Omega, with no name worth mentioning at court, the kind of person the kingdom forgot the moment she was born. But the pup in her arms was still breathing, still fighting, and she was not ready to let him lose that fight, because she was afraid of a wall and a few guards. So here she was, crouched behind a hedge just inside the royal garden, her hands shaking as she tried to catch her breath. The garden was more beautiful than she had ever imagined, moonlight spilling across rows of flowers she did not recognize, fountains carved from white stone, paths lined with lanterns that glowed a soft gold. It did not feel like a place a person like her was allowed to exist in, let alone steal from. She moved low and quiet, keeping to the shadows the way she had learned as a child, back when hiding from angry pack members had been a matter of survival. The guards were not close, their voices carrying faintly from somewhere near the front gate, laughing about something that had nothing to do with her. She was grateful for that. She needed every second she could get. The roses were not hard to find. They grew in a raised bed near the center of the garden, their petals a deep red that seemed to glow faintly even in the dark, almost like they held a small flame inside each one. Elira had never seen anything like them. She reached out with trembling fingers and hesitated, just for a moment, the weight of what she was about to do settling into her chest like a stone. If she was caught, she would die. She knew that. The law was not gentle to thieves, and it was even less gentle to thieves who dared touch anything belonging to the crown. But then she thought of the pup, wrapped in her cloak beneath the hedge, his breathing growing shallower with every passing minute, and her hesitation vanished. She picked 6 roses as quickly as she could, tucking them carefully into the fold of her tunic so the thorns would not tear the fragile petals. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped them twice. Somewhere behind her, a branch snapped. Elira froze. She turned slowly, expecting to see a guard with a blade already drawn, expecting the end of everything before it had even begun. Instead, she found a young man standing a few feet away, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. He was tall, with dark hair that fell just above sharp eyes, and he wore plain clothes, the kind a gardener or a servant might wear. He did not call out. He did not raise an alarm. He simply watched her, arms crossed, as if he had all the time in the world and nothing to fear from being seen with a thief in the middle of the night. "You're stealing from the king's garden," he said finally, his voice low and calm, almost amused. Elira's mind raced through excuses, through lies, through anything that might save her. None of them came. Instead, the truth spilled out before she could stop it. "There's a pup," she said quickly. "He's dying. Poisoned," the healer said. "These roses are the only thing that can save him." I didn't have a choice. She expected him to laugh at her, or worse, to call for the guards standing near the gate. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying her the way someone might study a puzzle they had not expected to find in their garden. "Where is this pup now?" he asked. "Under the hedge, by the outer wall," she said, glancing nervously toward the sound of distant voices. "Please, I don't have much time. If you're going to turn me in, do it after I save him. I'm not asking you to let me go. I'm asking you to let me finish this first." Something shifted in his expression, something she could not name. He did not answer right away. Instead, he walked past her, toward the hedge, and crouched down beside the small bundle of cloth she had left there. He pulled back the fabric gently, revealing the pup's small, trembling body, and for a long moment, he said nothing at all. "This is a war pup," he murmured, almost to himself. "Look at the markings on his paws. I haven't seen a pup like this in years." Illyra did not understand what he meant, and she did not have time to ask. "Please," she said again, "I need to get the medicine to the healer before it's too late." The man studied her for another moment, then rose to his feet and looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, but close to one. "Follow me," he said. "There's a faster way out than the wall you climbed, and you'll need somewhere quiet to prepare that medicine without every guard in the palace finding you." Illyra hesitated, torn between suspicion and desperation. Everything about this felt wrong. A stranger who found her stealing from the royal garden and, instead of raising the alarm, offered to help her escape. It made no sense, but the pup's breathing was growing weaker by the second, and she did not have the luxury of overthinking her choices. "Why would you help me?" she asked, even as she gathered the pup back into her arms. "Because that pup deserves a chance," he said simply, already walking toward a narrow path she had not noticed before, hidden behind a row of tall hedges. "And because I'm curious what kind of person risks their life for a stranger's dog." She followed him because she had no better option, her mind spinning with questions she did not dare ask out loud. Who was this man, wandering the royal garden at night as if he owned the place, speaking with the guards' quiet confidence, but dressed like someone who worked the grounds? She told herself it did not matter. All that mattered was getting the roses to Vera before the poison finished what the blade had started. He led her through a maze of hedges and narrow stone paths, moving with the ease of someone who had walked this way 1,000 times before. Twice they had to duck into the shadows as guards passed on their rounds, and each time, he seemed to know exactly when and where to hide, as though he could predict their movements before they made them. Illyra's suspicion grew with every step, but so did her gratitude. Without him, she would have been caught within minutes. Finally, they reached a small gate hidden behind a wall of ivy, one she was certain she never would have found on her own. He pushed it open with practiced ease, revealing a narrow alley that led back toward the market square. "This will take you close to where you need to go," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. Illyra paused at the gate, glancing back at him one last time. The moonlight caught his face fully now, and for a strange moment, something about him seemed almost familiar, though she was certain she had never seen him before in her life. She shook the thought away. Exhaustion and fear were playing tricks on her mind. "Thank you," she said quietly, meaning it more than she had meant anything in a long time. "I don't know why you helped me, but thank you." He studied her for a long moment, the same curious look from before returning to his eyes. "Take care of that pup," he said, "and be more careful next time you decide to steal from the crown." Before she could respond, he turned and disappeared back into the shadows of the garden, leaving her alone in the alley with a dying pup in her arms and 6 stolen roses tucked against her chest. She did not have time to wonder about him any longer. She ran the rest of the way to Vera's home, her lungs burning, her legs aching, praying with every step that she was not already too late. When she burst through Vera's door, the old healer looked up from her work table, eyes widening at the sight of the roses clutched in Illyra's hands. "You actually did it," Vera breathed, disbelief and worry mixing in her voice. "Child, do you understand what you've just risked?" "I understand," Illyra said. laying the pup gently on the table. "Please, just save him." Vera worked quickly, crushing the rose petals into a thick paste with practiced hands, murmuring words Alira did not recognize as she applied it to the wound. The pup whimpered, then went still, his small chest rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths. Alira held her own breath, watching, waiting, praying to whatever gods might be listening that her reckless choice had not been for nothing. Minutes passed like hours. Then, finally, the pup's breathing began to even out, his trembling slowly fading into something closer to rest. Vera let out a long breath of her own and sat back, wiping sweat from her brow. "He's going to live," she said quietly. "The poison is fading. You got here just in time." Relief crashed over Alira so suddenly that her knees nearly gave out beneath her. She sank down beside the table, resting her hand gently on the pup's small head, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing beneath her palm. He was alive. Whatever came next, whatever price she might eventually pay for what she had done tonight, she would face it, knowing she had saved a life that mattered. She did not yet know how much that single choice would change everything. She did not know that the roses she had stolen were tied to the protection of the royal bloodline itself, or that the theft would soon send the entire kingdom into an uproar. And she certainly did not know that the quiet stranger who had helped her escape, the one with sharp eyes and an easy confidence, was not a gardener at all. He was Kale, heir to the throne, son of the most feared alpha king the kingdom had ever known. And their paths, now crossed by fate and a dying pup, were only just beginning. Outside, the night grew quieter, the guards finishing their rounds, none the wiser to what had happened beneath their watch. But somewhere within the palace walls, word was already beginning to spread that the royal roses had been disturbed, and soon, an investigation would begin that would shake the foundations of everything Alira thought she understood about her place in the world. For now, though, she allowed herself a single moment of peace, sitting beside the healer's table, watching the small pup breathe steadily for the first time in hours. Whatever storm was coming, she would face it when it arrived. Tonight, she had done what she set out to do. She had saved a life. And deep down, some quiet part of her wondered if the stranger in the garden would cross her path again. She had no idea just how soon that answer would come, or how deeply entangled her fate had already become with the last person in the kingdom she ever expected to meet. Alira did not sleep that night. She stayed beside Vera's table, long after the pup's breathing had steadied, watching his small chest rise and fall, as though her attention alone could keep him alive. Vera eventually made her sit in a chair near the fire, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and pressing a cup of warm broth into her hands. "You cannot save him and then let yourself collapse from exhaustion," Vera said gently. "Drink, rest. He will still be here in the morning." Alira obeyed, though her mind refused to quiet. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the garden, the glowing roses, the sharp-eyed stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and chosen, for reasons she still could not understand, to help her instead of turning her in. She thought of the way he had looked at the pup's paws, murmuring something about markings she did not understand. She thought of the calm, steady way he had moved through the garden, as though he belonged there more than anyone else. By the time dawn broke over the rooftops of the market square, Alira had convinced herself that she would never see him again. That was, she told herself, for the best. Whoever he was, he had seen her commit a crime punishable by death, and the safest thing she could do was disappear back into the anonymity of her life and never draw attention to herself again. She named the pup Ash for the gray dust-colored patch of fur along his back, the one part of him that had not been stained with blood the night she found him. Over the following days, she visited him every morning before her work at the market stalls, and every evening after, watching him grow stronger with a fierce, protective joy she had not expected to feel. He began to stand on his own within a week, wobbling on unsteady legs, and by the second week, he was well enough to follow her in small, clumsy circles around Vera's small yard. It was on one of those evenings, nearly 2 weeks after the theft, that Alira noticed someone watching her from across the street. He stood near the corner of the market square, dressed in the same plain clothes she remembered, his sharp eyes fixed on her, with the same quiet curiosity from that night in the garden. Alira's heart lurched, half in fear, half in something she refused to name. She considered running, but something about the calm way he watched her made her hesitate. If he had wanted to turn her in, he would have done so already. He had known where to find her for 2 weeks, and had said nothing. She crossed the street instead, Ash trotting at her heels, and stopped a few feet away from him. "You're following me," she said, keeping her voice low. "I'm checking on the pup," he replied, though his eyes stayed on her rather than Ash. "He looks well." "No thanks to the guards you work with," she muttered, glancing around nervously to make sure no one else was paying attention to their conversation. "Why are you really here?" He studied her for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice carried none of the amusement it had held the night in the garden. It was quieter now, more careful. "Because what you did was reckless and dangerous, and yet you did it anyway, for a creature that could not repay you in any way that mattered. I wanted to understand why." Alira crossed her arms, unsure how to respond to that kind of honesty from a stranger. "He was dying," she said simply. "I couldn't just walk away." "Most people would have," he said. "Most people do, every day, for creatures far less demanding than a dying pup in the middle of the night." "Then most people are wrong," she said, more sharply than she intended. Something flickered across his face, an emotion she could not quite name, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Perhaps," he said. "Tell me your name." She hesitated, old instincts warning her against giving strangers information they could use against her. But something about the quiet sincerity in his voice made her lower her guard, just slightly. "Alira," she said finally. "And you?" "Kale," he answered, and something about the simplicity of the name felt deliberately incomplete, as though he had left something unsaid. She did not press him on it. She had her own secrets to protect, and she was not about to demand his in return. Over the following weeks, their meetings became a quiet, unspoken routine. Kale would appear near the market square in the evenings, sometimes waiting by the fountain, sometimes leaning against the wall outside Vera's home, always dressed simply, always careful not to draw attention. Alira told herself each time that she would keep the conversation brief, that she would not let herself grow comfortable around someone who held her secret in his hands. And each time, she found herself lingering longer than she intended, drawn in by the quiet way he listened, the careful attention he paid to Ash's recovery, the questions he asked about her life that no one else had ever bothered to ask. She learned, slowly, that he was unusually knowledgeable about the palace grounds, about the guards' schedules, about the history of the royal gardens, and the strange old wards placed upon them. She assumed, given his access and his knowledge, that he must work closely with the royal family in some capacity, perhaps as an assistant to one of the palace stewards, or a trusted servant, with more freedom than most. It never crossed her mind that the truth might be far grander than that. Why would it? Nothing about the way he carried himself suggested wealth or power. No fine clothes, no jewelry, no guards trailing behind him. He simply seemed like a person who had learned to move quietly through a world that watched him too closely, and Alira, who had spent her own life trying to move unseen through a world that ignored her completely, understood that kind of caution better than most. Ash grew fond of him too, in his own clumsy way, bounding toward Kale's legs each time he arrived, tail wagging with an enthusiasm that made Alira's chest ache with something she did not want to examine too closely. Kale, for his part, seemed genuinely pleased by the pup's affection, kneeling down to scratch behind his ears with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the guarded, careful way he spoke about everything else in his life. "He has good instincts," said one evening, watching Ash chase a moth across the yard with clumsy enthusiasm. "War pups usually do. They're bred to sense danger before it arrives." "War pups," Alira repeated, remembering the phrase from that first night in the garden. "You said that before. What does it mean?" Kale hesitated, and for a moment, Alira thought he might actually answer honestly. Instead, he offered a careful, measured response. "It means he comes from a bloodline trained for battle, generations back. Pups like him are rare now. Most of that bloodline was lost a long time ago." "Lost how?" she pressed. "It's a long story," he said, and something in his tone told her this was not a conversation he was willing to continue. She let it go, though her curiosity lingered. Another quiet mystery layered on top of all the others surrounding this strange, careful man who had appeared in her life at the exact moment she needed him most. It was nearly a month after the night in the garden when the first real signs of trouble began to surface. Alira noticed it first in the market square, in the way conversations shifted and quieted whenever the topic of the royal garden came up. She heard whispers of missing roses, of guards being questioned, of an investigation ordered directly by the king himself. Her stomach twisted every time she heard the words, though she told herself the connection was impossible to trace, that no one had seen her that night except for Kale, and he had shown no sign of betraying her secret. Still, the fear settled into her chest like a stone she could not shake, growing heavier with every passing day. She began glancing over her shoulder more often, flinching at the sight of guards patrolling near the market, jumping at sudden knocks on Vera's door. Kale noticed the change in her almost immediately, though she tried to hide it. "You're afraid," he said one evening, watching her closely as she absently stroked Ash's fur, her eyes distant and unfocused. "I heard about the investigation," she admitted quietly, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "They're looking for whoever took the roses. What happens if they find me?" Kale was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the fading evening light. "They won't find you," he said finally, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised her. "How can you be so sure?" she asked. "Because I won't let them," he said simply, and something in the quiet, unwavering conviction of his words settled her fear. At least for the moment, even as new questions rose to take its place. Who was this man, with the confidence to promise protection from the Crown's own investigation, and why did she believe him so completely, when every instinct she had spent her whole life sharpening told her that trust was a luxury people like her could not afford? She did not have answers to those questions yet, but as the weeks passed and Ash continued to grow strong and healthy beneath her care, she found herself trusting Kale more with each quiet evening they spent together, unaware that the ground beneath her was shifting in ways she could not yet see, and that the truth about the man she had come to trust so completely was far more dangerous and far more complicated than she could have imagined. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Alira had never expected to have in her life, one built around small, quiet moments that felt strangely precious against the backdrop of her ordinary struggles. She still worked her long hours at the market stalls, still lived in the small rented room above a bakery that smelled of bread every morning, still counted every coin carefully to make sure she had enough for food and rent. But now, each evening carried the promise of Ash's clumsy greeting, and, more often than not, Kale's quiet company beside the fountain or in Vera's small yard. Ash had grown remarkably in the past month. His once thin frame had filled out with steady meals and careful care. His fur had grown thick and glossy, and his legs, once too weak to hold his weight, now carried him in confident, energetic bounds around the yard. Vera often remarked that she had never seen an animal heal so completely, so quickly, and Alira found herself wondering, more than once, if the royal roses held some kind of power beyond what any ordinary herb could offer. "He's stronger than a pup his age should be," Vera commented one afternoon, watching Ash leap effortlessly over a low stack of firewood. "And smarter too. Look at the way he watches everything." Alira had noticed the same thing. Ash seemed to understand far more than an ordinary pup should, responding to her moods with an almost unsettling awareness, positioning himself protectively near her whenever strangers passed too close, growling low in his throat at anyone who raised their voice nearby. She did not know what to make of it, only that she felt safer with him at her side, and that the bond between them had grown into something she could not imagine living without. Kale continued to visit, though his visits grew less predictable as the weeks passed, sometimes arriving early in the evening, sometimes disappearing for several days before returning without explanation. Alira learned not to ask too many questions about his absences, sensing instinctively that there were parts of his life he was not yet ready to share with her, just as there were parts of her own life she kept carefully guarded. It was during one of these evenings, as the sun dipped low behind the rooftops and the market square grew quiet, that Alira finally allowed herself to ask the question that had been building in her mind for weeks. "Why do you keep coming back?" she asked, watching him carefully as he sat on the low stone wall bordering Vera's yard. Ash curled contentedly at his feet. "You barely know me. You have no reason to spend your evenings here instead of wherever you're supposed to be." Cale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the yard, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried an honesty that surprised her. "I spend most of my life surrounded by people who want something from me," he said slowly. "Flattery, favors, position. Everyone has an angle, a reason for the kindness they show me. You're the first person in a long time who has never asked me for anything at all." Alira absorbed his words carefully, sensing the weight behind them, the loneliness he rarely allowed himself to show. "That sounds like a lonely way to live," she said quietly. "It is," he admitted, and something in the simple honesty of that confession made her chest ache in a way she did not fully understand. "You could tell me who you really are," she offered gently. "I've noticed the way people react around you, even when you try to hide it. The guards, the way you know things about the palace that a gardener never would." Cale's expression grew carefully guarded again, the walls she had grown familiar with rising back into place. "Not yet," he said. "I will, but not yet." Alira did not push further, respecting the boundary he had drawn even as her curiosity gnawed at her. She had her own reasons for understanding the value of careful secrets, and she was not about to demand he abandon his simply because she wanted answers. Instead, she changed the subject, asking him about small, ordinary things, his favorite foods, whether he had ever traveled beyond the kingdom's borders, what he thought of the strange purple flowers that bloomed along the market square each spring. Cale answered each question with a quiet thoughtfulness that told her he was not used to being asked about himself in ways that had nothing to do with duty or expectation. And slowly, the tension between them eased into something warmer, something that felt, for the first time, like genuine friendship. It was Ash who noticed the danger first, weeks later, on an evening that began no differently than any other. Alira had just finished closing up her market stall when she felt Ash stiffen beside her, his ears pinning back, a low growl building in his throat, as his attention fixed on something across the square. She followed his gaze and spotted two men in dark cloaks watching her from a distance, their faces obscured by deep hoods despite the mild evening air. Something about the way they stood, too still, too deliberate, sent a chill down her spine. She gathered her things quickly and began walking, Ash pressed tightly against her leg, his growl deepening as the two men began to follow at a careful distance. Alira's heart pounded as she quickened her pace, cutting through narrow side streets in an attempt to lose them, but every glance over her shoulder confirmed they were still there, matching her pace with unsettling precision. By the time she reached Vera's home, breathless and shaking, the men had vanished, swallowed by the shadows of the evening streets. She told herself it was nothing, perhaps thieves scouting an easy target, perhaps simply strangers walking in the same direction. But Ash's continued agitation, his refusal to settle even hours later, told her otherwise. When Cale arrived that evening, later than usual, she told him what had happened, watching his expression darken with a seriousness she had not seen from him before. "Describe them," he said, his voice sharper, more focused than she had ever heard it. She did her best, describing the dark cloaks, the deliberate way they had moved, the way Ash had reacted the moment he spotted them. Cale listened carefully, his jaw tightening with each detail, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing something in his mind. "The investigation into the missing roses has expanded," he said finally, his voice low. "The king believes whoever took them may be connected to something larger. There have been threats against the royal bloodline in recent months, old enemies looking for any weakness they can exploit. If those men were watching you, it's possible they suspect your involvement." Alira's blood ran cold at his words. "How would they even know to suspect me?" she whispered. "No one saw me that night except you." Cale's expression grew troubled, something she had not seen from him before, a flicker of guilt crossing his features before he carefully smoothed it away. "I don't know," he said, though something in his tone told her there was more he was not saying. "But I intend to find out. Until then, I need you to be careful. Stay close to Vera. Keep Ash with you at all times, and if you see those men again, get somewhere safe immediately, and send word to me." "Send word how?" she asked. "I don't even know where you live." He hesitated, weighing something carefully in his mind, before reaching into his cloak and retrieving a small, plain token carved from dark wood, etched with a symbol she did not recognize. "Give this to any guard at the palace gate," he said, pressing it into her hand. "Tell them it belongs to Chaol. They'll bring word to me immediately." Elira stared at the token in her palm, turning it over slowly, sensing the weight of what he was offering her, and access to something far beyond what an ordinary gardener or servant could provide. Her suspicion sharpened again, old questions rising back to the surface, but the fear coursing through her from the encounter in the square outweighed her curiosity for the moment. "Thank you," she said quietly, tucking the token safely into her pocket. Chaol studied her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, before he nodded and rose to leave, promising to return the following evening with whatever information he could gather. Elira watched him disappear into the darkness beyond the yard. Ash pressed close against her side, and found herself wondering, not for the first time, just how much danger she had truly walked into the night she climbed over that garden wall. She had no way of knowing that the men who had followed her that evening were not ordinary thieves or curious strangers, but scouts sent by a rival faction within the kingdom, one that had been watching the royal family for months, waiting for exactly the kind of weakness her theft had accidentally exposed. Nor did she know that Chaol's guilt in that moment stemmed from something far more significant than simple worry, a secret about his own identity and the true danger surrounding the missing roses that he was not yet ready to reveal. The storm building around her was far larger than she understood, and it was only beginning to gather strength. The days following the encounter in the market square passed in a haze of tension for Elira. She found herself constantly checking over her shoulder, flinching at unfamiliar footsteps, keeping Ash close at all times, despite his growing size making him harder to carry in a hurry. Vera noticed the change immediately, her sharp eyes catching the way Elira's hands trembled slightly whenever she latched the door each evening. "You're not sleeping," Vera observed one morning, setting a cup of tea in front of her. "And you jump at every sound." "Child, what happened?" Elira hesitated, unsure how much to share, even with the woman who had helped save Ash's life. She trusted Vera, but the less anyone knew about the strange men who had followed her, the safer she felt keeping them. "Just tired," she said finally, though she suspected Vera did not believe the lie for a moment. Chaol returned the following evening as promised, his expression carrying the same seriousness from before, though something in his demeanor had shifted, more guarded, more careful. He settled into his usual spot near the fountain, Ash immediately bounding over to greet him with his typical enthusiasm, though even the pup seemed to sense the tension in the air, settling quickly, instead of continuing his usual energetic circles. "I looked into what happened," Chaol said without preamble. "The men who followed you were not palace guards, and they were not associated with the investigation into the roses directly, but they were seen near the palace grounds in the days before, asking questions about recent unusual activity." Elira's stomach twisted with unease. "What does that mean?" "It means someone outside the palace has taken an interest in what happened that night," Chaol said carefully, "and it means I need to move more quickly than I intended to protect you." "Protect me how?" she asked, watching him closely. "You still haven't told me who you really are, Chaol. How can you protect me from something you won't even explain?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze dropping to where Ash sat between them, tail thumping softly against the ground. When he finally looked back up at her, something in his expression had changed, a decision made, a weight settling more firmly onto his shoulders. "There are things about my life that are complicated," he said slowly. "Things that put anyone close to me at a certain kind of risk, whether they want that risk or not. I should have told you sooner. I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you would want nothing more to do with me, and selfishly, I wasn't ready to lose the only honest friendship I've had in longer than I care to admit." Elira's heart pounded, uncertain whether to feel touched by his honesty or afraid of what he was building toward. "Just tell me," she said quietly. "Whatever it is, I can handle it." Chaol opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the sound of urgent footsteps echoed from the street beyond the yard, followed by a sharp knock at Vera's door. Elira startled, her heart leaping into her throat, and Ash was on his feet instantly, a low growl building in his chest, as he positioned himself protectively in front of her. Vera answered the door cautiously, and Alira heard the low murmur of an unfamiliar voice, urgent and hushed. A moment later, Vera reappeared in the yard, her face pale with worry. "There's a man at the door," she said quietly. "He says he's a royal tracker, sent by the palace. He's asking about a war pup." Alira's blood ran cold. She looked instinctively toward Cale, searching for some sign of what to do, but his expression had gone carefully blank, unreadable in a way she had never seen before. "Let him in," Cale said finally, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from him. "It's all right." "I know him." Alira wanted to protest, wanted to demand more explanation before allowing a stranger claiming royal authority anywhere near her or Ash, but something in Cale's certainty made her hold her tongue, trusting him despite every instinct screaming at her to run. The man who entered the yard a moment later was older, perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair and sharp, observant eyes that immediately fixed on Ash with an intensity that made Alira's protective instincts flare. He wore simple traveling clothes, though something about his bearing suggested a rank far beyond an ordinary tracker. "Torin," Cale said in greeting, and the man's eyes widened slightly at the sight of him, quickly followed by a deep, respectful bow that made Alira's confusion deepen further. "My prince," Torin said, and the words hit Alira like a physical blow, the ground seeming to tilt beneath her feet. "I did not expect to find you here." The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, Alira staring at Cale with growing disbelief, pieces beginning to click into place in her mind, pieces she had refused to fully examine until this exact moment, the ease with which he moved through the palace grounds. The guard's deference, the token he had given her, carved with a symbol she now realized must belong to the royal family itself. "Prince," she repeated slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "You're the prince." Cale's expression carried a mixture of guilt and resignation as he turned to face her fully. "I was going to tell you," he said quietly. "I swear to you. I was going to tell you tonight." Alira felt a dizzying rush of emotions crash over her all at once, betrayal chief among them, followed closely by fear, as the true weight of her situation settled fully into her mind. She had not simply stolen roses from the royal garden. She had stolen from this man's own family, and he had known that from the very first night, had watched her steal, had helped her escape, and had said nothing. "You knew," she said, her voice trembling. "That night in the garden, you knew exactly what I was stealing, and you let me walk away with it." "I did," he admitted, no attempt to deny it, "and I would make the same choice again." Before Alira could respond, Torin cleared his throat carefully, drawing their attention back to the matter at hand. "My prince, forgive the interruption, but the matter I've come about cannot wait. The pup." He gestured toward Ash, who had pressed himself even closer against Alira's legs, sensing the tension surrounding him. "May I examine him?" Cale glanced at Alira, silently asking permission, before allowing Torin to approach, a small gesture that, despite everything, told her he still respected her role in Ash's care. She nodded numbly, still reeling from the revelation, and watched as Torin knelt down carefully, examining the markings along Ash's paws with a focus that bordered on reverence. "It's true then," Torin murmured after a long moment, looking up at Cale with an expression of stunned disbelief. "This is one of the lost war pups. I thought that bloodline had been wiped out entirely." "Apparently not," Cale said quietly. "Alira found him dying near the border. She's the reason he's alive at all." Torin's gaze shifted to Alira with newfound respect, though the weight of his next words settled heavily over the yard. "Then you should know, young lady, that this pup's survival is not simply a matter of fortune. These war pups were bonded, generations ago, to the royal family's fallen allies, families who lost everything in the conflicts that shaped this kingdom. There are those who would want him found, for reasons that have nothing to do with his well-being." Alira's arms tightened protectively around Ash without thinking, her fear for his safety momentarily overriding her anger at Cale's deception. "What kind of people?" she asked. "Old rivals," Cale answered grimly. "Families who lost their claim to power generations ago, and have never stopped resenting my father's rule. If word spreads that a war pup has resurfaced, and that he was found near the palace grounds during the same time the royal roses went missing, It will not take long for the wrong people to draw dangerous conclusions. The full scope of the danger Alira had unknowingly walked into finally settled over her, heavy and suffocating. She was no longer simply a thief who might face punishment for stealing royal roses. She was now tangled in a web of old political conflicts, hidden bloodlines, and dangerous rivalries she barely understood, all because she had refused to let a dying pup die alone in the dark. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, looking between Cale and Torin with growing dread. Cale's expression was grim, resolute. "Now," he said, "I make sure nothing happens to either of you, whatever it takes." Alira wanted to trust those words completely, wanted to believe that this prince who had lied to her for weeks could truly protect her from dangers she was only beginning to understand. But as Torin took his leave, promising to report only what was necessary to the king for now, and as Cale remained behind in the quiet yard, watching her with an expression full of guilt and determination in equal measure, she realized that trust was no longer a simple thing between them. Too much had changed in the span of a single conversation, and the storm that had been building quietly around her for weeks had just broken fully into the open, with no clear shelter in sight. Sleep did not come easily to Alira that night. She lay awake long after Cale had gone, staring at the low ceiling of her small room above the bakery, Ash curled against her side, his steady breathing the only calm thing in a world that suddenly felt tilted off its axis. She replayed every conversation, every quiet evening by the fountain, searching for signs she had missed, moments where the truth should have been obvious. A prince, wandering the market square in plain clothes, spending his evenings with a market vendor and her stray pup. It seemed impossible, and yet it explained so much that had never quite made sense. By morning, exhaustion had worn her anger down into something quieter, more complicated. She was still hurt by the deception, still unsettled by how easily he had let her believe a comfortable lie for weeks. But she could not deny the sincerity in his voice when he had promised to protect her, nor could she ignore the fact that he had risked his own position, however briefly, to help a stranger save a dying pup on the very first night they met. Vera found her sitting quietly at the small kitchen table, staring into a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "You look like someone who has not decided whether to be furious or forgiving," the old healer observed, settling into the chair across from her. "I don't know what I am," Alira admitted. "He lied to me for weeks, and now I'm apparently caught up in some conflict between royal families I've never even heard of." "And yet," Vera said gently, "he still came back last night, even after the truth came out. He did not run from the consequences of his own dishonesty. That says something about a person, even when the rest of the picture is complicated." Alira did not have an answer for that. She simply nodded, gathering Ash into her arms as she prepared to face whatever the day would bring. Cale returned that afternoon, earlier than usual, his expression carrying the weight of a sleepless night, much like her own. He did not attempt to smooth over what had happened, did not offer excuses for his silence. Instead, he simply sat across from her in Vera's small yard and waited, allowing her the space to speak first if she chose to. "I'm still angry with you," she said finally, breaking the silence between them. "You have every right to be," he replied quietly. "But I understand why you did it," she continued, surprising herself with the honesty of the admission. "I think, if our positions were reversed, I might have done the same thing. It's easier to be someone ordinary, even for a little while, when the rest of your life demands so much." Cale's shoulders relaxed slightly, some of the tension leaving his frame at her words. "I never meant for it to go on this long," he said. "Each time I planned to tell you, something held me back. I was afraid of exactly this, of watching you look at me differently once you knew." "I don't know if I look at you differently," she admitted. "I think I just need time to understand what any of this means, for me, for Ash, for whatever this is between us." He nodded, accepting her words without pushing for more than she was ready to give. Their conversation was interrupted, however, by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching the yard, and both of them tensed instinctively, memories of the two hooded men still fresh in their minds. It was only Torin, however, his expression grim, as he delivered news that settled heavily over the small gathering. "The king has ordered a full search of the market district," Torin said without preamble. Word of the missing roses has spread further than we hoped, and pressure from the council has forced his hand. Guards will be searching every home and stall by tomorrow morning. Alira's heart pounded at the news. They'll find the roses, she said, panic rising in her voice. Vera still has the crushed petals from that night. If they search her home. They won't find anything incriminating, Cale said quickly, though his own expression carried a flicker of worry. The roses were used entirely on Ash's wound. There's nothing left to find. But they'll find Ash, Alira said, the true danger settling into focus. A war pup, recovering suspiciously close to the same time the roses disappeared. That alone will be enough to draw attention, even without proof. Torin's grim expression confirmed her fear. She's right, my prince. If the search reaches this district, questions will be asked that will be difficult to answer, without revealing far more than we intended to. At least not yet. Cale was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing their limited options. Then we move him somewhere safer, tonight, he said finally. Somewhere the search will not reach. Where? Alira asked, though she already suspected the answer, and the fear that came with it. The palace, Cale said. There are places within the grounds no search will ever touch. And it means I can protect both of you directly, rather than relying on distance and secrecy that has already begun to fail. The idea of stepping willingly into the palace, the very place she had committed her crime, sent a fresh wave of terror through Alira. But she also understood, with growing clarity, that the danger surrounding Ash had grown too large for hiding in plain sight to remain a viable option. Whatever fear she felt about facing the palace directly, it paled in comparison to the fear of losing Ash to forces far more dangerous than a simple search. All right, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. But I'm not leaving him alone there. Wherever he goes, I go. Cale studied her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering behind his carefully controlled expression. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said quietly. That night, under the cover of darkness once again, Alira found herself walking back toward the very garden where this entire journey had begun, Ash trotting quietly at her side, Cale leading them through hidden paths, only he seemed to know. The irony was not lost on her, returning to the scene of her crime, not as a thief this time, but as someone seeking shelter within the very walls she had once feared most. As they moved through the shadowed grounds, Alira could not shake the feeling that they were being watched, an unease that settled deep in her bones despite Cale's assurances of safety. She glanced over her shoulder more than once, catching glimpses of movement in the darkness that vanished the moment she focused on them, and Ash's low, uneasy growls did little to calm her nerves. They reached a quiet, secluded wing of the palace grounds without incident, and Alira allowed herself a small breath of relief as Cale led them through a hidden door into a modest but comfortable chamber, far removed from the grand halls she had imagined the palace to contain. You'll be safe here, Cale said, watching as Ash immediately began exploring every corner of the unfamiliar room with cautious curiosity. I've arranged for guards I trust completely to watch this wing. No one will disturb you without my knowledge. Alira nodded, though the unease from the walk here still lingered heavily in her chest. She did not yet know that the watchful presence she had sensed in the shadows was real, that agents loyal to a rival house had indeed followed their movements through the garden, gathering exactly the confirmation they needed. The war pup had resurfaced, and he was now within the palace walls themselves, guarded by the crown prince, who had unknowingly handed his enemies the perfect opportunity to strike at the heart of everything he sought to protect. The danger, far from being contained, had only just begun to close in. The palace was unlike anything Alira had ever experienced, a world of quiet halls and carved stone, of servants who moved with practiced silence, and guards who stood so still they seemed carved from the walls themselves. She stayed close to the modest chamber Cale had arranged for her, venturing out only when necessary, Ash always at her side like a living shield against a world she did not fully understand. The first few days passed with a tense, uneasy calm. Cale visited whenever his duties allowed, bringing news of the ongoing search through the market district, a search that had, thankfully, turned up nothing of consequence in Vera's home, or the surrounding stalls. Alira breathed easier, knowing her old life remained undisturbed, even as her new circumstances grew increasingly complicated. It was on the fourth night that everything changed. Elira woke suddenly, her instincts screaming a warning before her mind fully understood why. Ash was already on his feet beside her bed, his body rigid, ears pinned back, a low growl building steadily in his throat. She sat up quickly, heart pounding, straining to hear whatever had triggered his alarm. Then she heard it. A soft, deliberate scrape against the window latch, the unmistakable sound of someone attempting to force entry from outside. Elira's blood ran cold. She scrambled out of bed, grabbing Ash and pulling him close, backing away from the window toward the chamber door just as it burst open, not from the intruder outside, but from Chaol himself, sword drawn, expression fierce with an intensity she had never seen from him before. "Stay behind me," he said sharply, moving to position himself between her and the window just as the latch finally gave way, the glass sliding open to reveal a dark figure climbing swiftly into the room. What followed happened in a blur of motion too fast for Elira to fully process. Chaol moved with a trained precision that spoke of years of preparation for exactly this kind of danger, disarming the intruder within moments, pinning him against the wall with controlled, efficient force. Guards flooded into the room seconds later, drawn by the commotion, quickly securing the subdued attacker and dragging him away for questioning. Elira stood frozen throughout it all, Ash pressed tightly against her legs, her heart still hammering long after the danger had passed. Chaol turned to her immediately, sheathing his sword as he crossed the room, concern etched deeply into his features. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands hovering near her shoulders, as though ready to catch her if her legs gave out. "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice trembled slightly. "He came for Ash, didn't he?" Chaol's grim expression confirmed her fear. "Yes," he said quietly, "and he won't be the last." The following morning, Elira learned the full truth during a tense meeting in a private chamber, Torin and Chaol both present, along with a stern-faced advisor named Nolan, who studied her with careful, assessing eyes. The captured intruder, it turned out, belonged to a faction loyal to House Voss, an old noble family that had lost their claim to power generations ago during the conflicts that had established the current royal bloodline. House Voss has never accepted their fall from power, Nolan explained, his voice clipped and formal. For years, they've searched for any weakness that might allow them to challenge the throne's legitimacy. The resurfacing of a war pup, bonded originally to the fallen allies of the crown, is exactly the kind of symbol they could use to rally support against my prince's claim to succession. "They want to use Ash," Elira said slowly, understanding dawning with sickening clarity, "to prove something about the crown's weakness." "Precisely," Nolan confirmed. "And your involvement, discovered now by their agents, makes you a target as well, both as a potential source of information and as leverage against my prince, given his evident attachment to your well-being." Elira glanced instinctively toward Chaol at those words, catching the flicker of something raw and unguarded in his expression, before he carefully smoothed it away. The weight of what Nolan had just revealed settled heavily over the room, the true scope of the danger surrounding her finally coming into full, terrifying focus. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. It was Chaol who answered, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from him. "Now, the matter can no longer remain quiet. My father needs to be informed of everything. The theft, the war pup, the attack last night. I had hoped to handle this more carefully, but that is no longer an option." The mention of the king sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through Elira. She had imagined many possible confrontations since that first night in the garden, but facing the Alpha King himself, the man whose reputation for fierce, uncompromising judgment was known throughout the entire kingdom, had not been among the scenarios she felt prepared to survive. "Will he have me punished?" she asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. Chaol's expression softened slightly, though the worry did not fully leave his eyes. "I will not let that happen," he said firmly, "but I cannot promise the audience ahead of us will be easy. My father does not tolerate deception well, and there is much that has been kept from him regarding these past weeks." That afternoon, Elira found herself standing outside the towering doors of the throne room, her hands trembling despite her best efforts to appear calm, Ash pressed close against her side, as though sensing her fear. Kale stood beside her, his own posture carefully composed, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his own uncertainty about how this confrontation would unfold. "Whatever happens in there," he said quietly, just before the doors began to open, "know that I meant every word I said to you. I will protect you, no matter what my father decides." Elira wanted to believe him completely, wanted to trust that his position and his evident feelings for her would be enough to shield her from whatever judgment awaited on the other side of those doors. But as the massive doors swung open, revealing the imposing figure of the Alpha King seated upon his throne, his sharp eyes immediately finding hers with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs, she understood that the true test of everything she had risked was only just beginning. The king's gaze shifted from her to Ash, recognition and something far more complicated flickering across his weathered features, before finally settling on his son with an expression that promised a reckoning neither of them could avoid. "Explain," the king said, his voice carrying the quiet, controlled fury of a man used to absolute obedience. "Everything." The throne room felt impossibly vast, its high ceilings and towering pillars, designed to remind anyone who entered of exactly how small they were in comparison to the power seated upon the throne. Elira had never stood in a space like this, had never felt the weight of so many watching eyes, guards and advisors lining the walls, all silent, all waiting to see how their king would respond to the tangled truth about to unfold before him. Kale stepped forward first, his posture straightening into something more formal, more practiced. The easy warmth she had grown used to replaced by the careful composure of a prince addressing his king. "Father," he began, "the events of the past weeks were set into motion the night I discovered someone taking roses from the royal garden. I chose not to raise an alarm." The king's expression darkened further. "You chose to conceal a theft from the crown," he said, his voice deceptively calm in a way that made Elira's stomach twist with dread. "A theft involving the very roses tied to the protective wards placed upon our bloodline generations ago." "I did," Kale confirmed, offering no excuses, no attempt to soften the admission. "Because the person taking them was trying to save the life of a dying pup, a pup I quickly recognized as one of the lost war breed, bonded generations ago to families who stood beside our ancestors in battle. I judged in that moment that compassion mattered more than protocol." The king's sharp gaze shifted to Elira, studying her with an intensity that made her want to shrink into the floor. "And you," he said, his voice carrying none of the warmth he had shown his son, only cold, assessing judgment. "Step forward." Elira forced her trembling legs to carry her closer to the throne. Ash pressed tightly against her side, refusing to leave her even as guards shifted uneasily at the pup's proximity to the king. She bowed as best she understood the custom, uncertain if she was performing the gesture correctly, too afraid to worry about appearances beyond simply surviving this moment. "Your Majesty," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear coursing through her, "I understand the severity of what I did. I do not ask for forgiveness for breaking your law. I only ask that you understand I did not act out of malice or ambition. I found a dying creature, and I could not walk away and let him die simply because helping him meant breaking rules. I did not fully understand the weight of." The king studied her for a long, silent moment, his expression unreadable, before his gaze dropped to Ash, who sat obediently at her feet, despite his evident wariness of the imposing figure before them. Something shifted in the king's weathered features, a flicker of old memory surfacing behind his sharp eyes. "I have not seen markings like that in over 20 years, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "I thought that bloodline died with the fall of House Renwick, our most loyal allies during the war that secured this throne." "He's the last of them, apparently," Kale said carefully, "and House Voss has already made an attempt to seize him, recognizing the same significance you do." The king's expression hardened at that news, his attention snapping back to the present danger with renewed focus. "An attempt," he repeated sharply. "Explain." Kale recounted the attack from the previous night in careful detail, the intruder's connection to House Voss, the growing evidence that the rival house intended to use both Ash and Elira as leverage against the crown's legitimacy. The king listened in silence, his fury building visibly with each detail, until finally he rose from his throne, his imposing presence seeming to fill the entire room. "House Voss has tested my patience for the last time," he said, his voice carrying a controlled fury that made even the guards along the walls stand straighter. First with quiet insults at court, now with an attempt to seize what belongs under this crown's protection. He turned his attention back to Alira, studying her once more with an expression that had shifted, however slightly, from cold judgment toward something closer to careful consideration. "You saved a piece of this kingdom's history that I believed lost forever," he said finally. "That act alone carries weight, regardless of the law you broke to accomplish it. However, the theft cannot go entirely unaddressed, nor can the danger currently surrounding you and this pup be ignored." Alira held her breath, waiting for whatever judgment was about to fall, Ash pressing even closer against her legs, as though sensing the gravity of the moment. "You will remain within the palace," the king continued, "under direct protection, until the threat from House Voss has been fully addressed. The theft of the roses will be recorded as an act sanctioned retroactively by the crown, given the circumstances and outcome. You are, as of this moment, no longer considered a criminal against this throne." Relief crashed over Alira so suddenly her knees nearly buckled beneath her, a shaky breath escaping her lips as the weight of fear she had carried for weeks finally began to lift. Beside her, she felt Cale's hand brush briefly against hers, a small, silent gesture of shared relief that she did not have the composure to fully register in the moment. But the king was not finished. His sharp gaze shifted once more to his son, something more complicated settling into his expression. "And you," he said, "will explain to me, privately, exactly why a common market vendor has become important enough to you that you were willing to conceal a crime against the crown and place yourself in the position of protecting her so personally." Cale did not flinch from the question, his expression carrying a quiet resolve that made Alira's heart skip, despite the exhaustion and fear still coursing through her. "Because she is the bravest person I have encountered in longer than I can remember," he said simply, "and because whatever consequences come from that truth, I intend to see them through." The king studied his son for a long, measuring moment, something unreadable passing behind his sharp eyes, before finally gesturing for the audience to conclude. "We will speak further," he said, privately. "For now, ensure she and the pup remain safe. House Voss will not wait long to make another attempt, now that their first has failed." As the throne room doors closed behind them, Alira allowed herself, finally, to breathe fully. The immediate danger of judgment lifted, even as the larger threat from House Voss loomed heavier than ever over everything that lay ahead. In the days following the audience with the king, life within the palace settled into a strange new rhythm for Alira. She was given a proper chamber, far grander than the modest room she had first stayed in, though she found herself missing the simplicity of her old life above the bakery more than she expected. Guards now shadowed her movements whenever she left her chamber, a constant reminder of the danger still surrounding her, and Ash, despite his growing size and confidence, remained perpetually alert, as though he too understood that the threat from House Voss had not truly passed. Cale visited often, though their conversations now carried a different weight than the easy, anonymous evenings they had once shared by the fountain. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a truth acknowledged but not yet fully explored, and Alira found herself both drawn to and hesitant around him in equal measure, uncertain how to navigate a relationship that had begun in secrecy and now existed under the watchful eyes of an entire royal court. It was nearly 2 weeks after the audience with the king when the palace announced a formal gathering, a court event meant to celebrate the resolution of the investigation into the missing roses, though Alira suspected the true purpose was to publicly reaffirm the crown's strength in the face of House Voss's recent aggression. She had been informed, somewhat to her dismay, that her presence was expected, given her now undeniable connection to the recovered war pup and the prince himself. The evening of the gathering arrived, with a nervous energy Alira could not quite shake. Dressed in unfamiliar finery, provided by the palace, her hair arranged in a style far more elaborate than anything she had ever worn in her life. She felt like an imposter standing among the nobility gathered in the grand hall, though Cale's presence beside her, steady and reassuring, helped ease some of her discomfort. "You look like you're about to run," he murmured quietly, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite the seriousness of the occasion. "I might," she admitted, glancing nervously around the hall at the sea of unfamiliar, watchful faces. "I've never belonged in a place like this." "Neither have I, most days," he said, surprising her with the honesty of the admission. "You get used to it, eventually." Their conversation was interrupted by the announcement of the king's arrival, the hall falling into respectful silence as the Alpha King took his place at the head of the gathering, his sharp gaze sweeping over the assembled court, with the same commanding presence Alira remembered from their first audience. Beside him stood Ash, groomed and calm, wearing a simple ceremonial collar that marked his significance to the crown, a symbol of the bloodline he represented. The king spoke briefly, addressing the recent threats from House Voss, without naming them directly, reaffirming the strength and unity of the crown in the face of old rivalries seeking to exploit any weakness they could find. Alira listened carefully, sensing the underlying tension beneath his carefully measured words, aware that this gathering was as much a warning to their enemies as it was a celebration. It was during the quieter moments following the king's address, as the gathering shifted into more informal conversation and music began to fill the hall, that the first sign of trouble emerged. Alira noticed it before anyone else, a subtle shift in Ash's posture near the king's side, his ears pinning back, a low, barely audible growl building in his throat, despite his usual calm composure in formal settings. She moved instinctively closer, scanning the crowd for whatever had triggered his unease, and spotted a cluster of unfamiliar nobles near the hall's far entrance, their expressions carefully neutral in a way that felt deliberately practiced. "Something's wrong," she murmured to Chaol, nodding subtly toward the group. Chaol's gaze followed hers, his expression sharpening with immediate recognition. "House Voss," he said quietly. "They were not invited to this gathering." Before either of them could act on the warning, chaos erupted through the hall, guards shouting, nobles screaming, and scattering, as a group of armed intruders surged through the entrance, weapons drawn, clearly having used the chaos of the gathering as cover for their assault. Alira's heart lurched as she watched several of the intruders move with clear purpose directly toward the king and Ash, the true target of their attack now undeniably clear. Chaol moved instantly, drawing his sword as he positioned himself protectively in front of Alira, shouting orders to nearby guards even as he pushed forward to defend his father. Alira grabbed Ash instinctively, pulling him back from the advancing threat, her mind racing through options as the hall descended further into chaos around her. The fighting was fierce but brief, palace guards responding with trained efficiency to neutralize the threat, though not before several tense, terrifying moments where the outcome remained uncertain. Alira watched, frozen with fear, as Chaol fought with a controlled ferocity she had not fully witnessed before, his blade meeting each attacker with practiced precision until the last of the intruders had been subdued or driven back. When the chaos finally settled, the hall left in disarray, overturned tables and scattered decorations, a stark contrast to the celebration that had begun the evening. Alira found herself pulled into Chaol's arms, his hands trembling slightly as he checked her for any sign of injury. "I'm all right," she assured him, though her own hands shook as she held Ash close, the pup pressed tightly against her, unharmed, but clearly shaken by the violence that had erupted around them. The king, unharmed but visibly furious, surveyed the damage to his hall with a cold, calculating expression that promised swift retribution against House Voss for their brazen attack. "This," he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet hall, "ends now. Gather the council. House Voss will answer for this before the sun rises again." As guards moved to secure the hall and tend to the few injuries sustained during the brief but violent confrontation, Alira remained close to Chaol, her heart still pounding from the terror of the attack, the reality of the danger surrounding her and Ash, more visceral now than any warning or explanation had managed to convey. She understood, in that moment, that whatever peace she had hoped to find within the palace walls remained fragile, threatened by forces determined to see her, and everyone she had come to care for, destroyed for the sake of old, bitter rivalries. The conflict was no longer a distant threat lurking in the shadows. It had arrived, violent and undeniable, directly into the heart of the palace itself, and Alira knew, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that the true resolution of this danger was still to come. The aftermath of the attack left the palace in a state of heightened alert. Guards doubled at every entrance, the council summoned before dawn to address the brazen assault that had struck at the very heart of the kingdom's power. Elira barely slept that night, replaying the chaos of the hall over and over in her mind. Ash curled tightly against her side, his own rest fitful and uneasy. Chaol came to her chamber early the following morning, his expression carrying the exhaustion of a sleepless night spent in council meetings, though a steely determination burned beneath the fatigue in his eyes. "We've identified the leader behind the attack," he said without preamble, settling into the chair across from her. "A man named Lucian, a distant cousin to the head of House Voss. He was captured during the fighting last night." "What did he say?" Elira asked, sitting up fully, Ash lifting his head at the shift in her posture. "Enough to confirm what we already suspected," Chaol said grimly. House Voss intended to seize Ash during the chaos of the attack, using him as proof that the crown's protective wards are weakening, a symbol they planned to rally supporters around in an attempt to challenge my father's legitimacy. They also intended to take you as leverage, understanding my attachment to your safety. The confirmation of just how deeply she and Ash had become entangled in this dangerous political conflict settled heavily over Elira, though something in Chaol's tone told her there was more he had not yet shared. "There's something else," she said carefully. "I can hear it in your voice." Chaol hesitated, then nodded slowly. Lucian revealed the location of House Voss's remaining forces within the kingdom, a hidden compound beyond the northern border, where they've been gathering support and resources for months. My father intends to move against them directly, ending this threat permanently rather than allowing it to fester and strike again. "And you're going with him," Elira said, understanding dawning with a fresh wave of fear. "I have to," Chaol said quietly. "This conflict began in many ways because of choices I made the night I chose to protect you instead of raising the alarm. I won't hide from the consequences of that choice now." Elira's chest tightened with worry, though she understood, even through her fear, that she could not ask him to abandon this responsibility. "Then I'm coming with you," she said firmly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Chaol's expression shifted immediately to concern. "Elira, this isn't like the danger we've faced within the palace walls. This will be a direct confrontation, likely violent, with forces determined to see the crown weakened by any means necessary. It's too dangerous. And Ash is the reason this entire conflict exists," she countered. "If there's any chance my presence, or his, could help resolve this without more bloodshed, I want to be there. I've already run from danger once, the night I found him dying near the border. I'm not running again." Their conversation was interrupted by Torin's arrival, bearing further news from the ongoing council meeting, and the debate over Elira's involvement was ultimately settled not by argument, but by necessity. It was determined that Ash's presence, as living proof of the crown's continued protection over the Warpup bloodline, might serve as a powerful symbol, capable of undermining House Voss's claims before their gathered supporters, potentially avoiding a more violent confrontation altogether. 3 days later, Elira found herself riding alongside Chaol and a contingent of royal guards toward the northern border, Ash trotting steadily beside her horse, his growing size and confident, bearing a stark contrast to the trembling, dying pup she had carried through the garden all those weeks ago. The journey was tense, quiet, every member of the group aware of the danger awaiting them at their destination. The compound, when they finally reached it, was smaller than Elira had expected, a fortified estate hidden within a dense forest near the border, its walls patrolled by armed men who scrambled into defensive positions the moment the royal contingent came into view. Tension crackled through the air as both sides prepared for potential conflict, until the king himself rode forward, his commanding presence silencing the immediate threat of violence, at least for the moment. "Lord Voss," the king called out, addressing the aging man who emerged from the compound's main building, flanked by several advisors. "Your kinsman's attack on my hall has given me every right to raze this compound to the ground. I am offering you one chance to avoid that fate. Surrender your claims against the crown, formally and permanently, or face the full consequences of your family's continued defiance." Lord Voss's gaze swept over the gathered royal contingent, lingering with obvious surprise on Ash, standing calmly beside Alira's horse, his royal collar catching the morning light. Something shifted in the old lord's expression, calculation giving way, slowly, to a weary kind of resignation. "The pup lives," he said quietly, more to himself than to the king. "Then the old wards truly do hold strong. Our claims were built on the belief that your bloodline's protection had weakened beyond recovery. It seems we were wrong." The tension in the clearing remained thick, but something had shifted with Lord Voss's words, the fight visibly draining from his posture as the reality of his failed gamble settled over him. After a long, tense negotiation, conducted carefully between the king and Lord Voss, while Alira and the others waited anxiously nearby, House Voss agreed to formally renounce any further claims against the throne, their compound placed under royal oversight to ensure compliance, their remaining forces disbanded under careful watch. It was not the violent confrontation Alira had feared, and as the royal contingent finally began the journey back toward the palace, exhaustion and relief mixing heavily in her chest, she allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to believe that the danger surrounding her and Ash might truly be coming to an end. Kale rode close beside her for much of the journey home, his relief evident despite his continued vigilance, and it was during a quiet moment, as they paused to rest the horses near a small stream, that he finally voiced something that had clearly been building within him for some time. "You didn't have to come," he said quietly, watching her carefully. "You could have stayed safely within the palace, and let this resolve without you." "I know," Alira said, watching Ash wade happily through the shallow water nearby, "but I wanted to see this through. All of it. Not because someone else decided it was necessary, but because I chose to." Kale studied her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded settling into his expression. "You continue to surprise me," he said softly. "Every single time I think I understand the full measure of your courage, you show me there's more." Alira felt heat rise to her cheeks at his words, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with fear or danger, for the first time in longer than she could remember. "I suppose we make quite the pair then," she said, a small smile finally breaking through the exhaustion of the past weeks. "A reckless thief and a prince who let her get away with it." Kale's answering smile was soft, genuine, free of the careful guardedness that had once defined so much of their early conversations. "I wouldn't trade that reckless choice for anything," he said quietly. "It brought me the two most important companions I've ever had." As they resumed their journey back toward the palace, the danger from House Voss finally resolved, Alira allowed herself to look forward, for the first time, to whatever came next, uncertain still of exactly what her place within this new world might become, but no longer afraid to find out. The palace welcomed them back with a quiet relief that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the attack weeks before. Word of House Voss's surrender spread quickly through the court, and with it came a shift in how Alira found herself treated within the palace walls, no longer viewed with suspicion or curiosity as the mysterious commoner tied to a royal scandal, but with a growing respect that still felt unfamiliar and slightly overwhelming. Ash, now fully grown into his role as the last surviving war pup of House Renwick's ancient bloodline, had become something of a celebrated figure within the palace himself, guards and servants alike greeting him with genuine warmth whenever he trotted confidently through the halls, always keeping close to Alira's side despite his newfound status. It was nearly a month after their return from the northern border when the king summoned Alira for a private audience. A request that sent a fresh wave of nervous uncertainty through her, old fears of judgment resurfacing, despite the peaceful resolution of recent weeks. She found him in a smaller, less formal chamber than the grand throne room, seated near a window overlooking the very garden where her journey had first begun. "You've caused quite a disruption to this kingdom's careful order," the king said as she entered, though something in his tone carried less severity than she expected, closer to wry amusement than genuine reproach. "I'm aware, Your Majesty," she said carefully, uncertain how to navigate the shifting dynamics of their relationship. "And yet," he continued, gesturing for her to sit across from him, "that disruption revealed a threat to this crown that had been quietly gathering strength for years, unnoticed, until your reckless act of compassion forced it into the open." House Voss's ambitions would have continued festering indefinitely had events not unfolded exactly as they did. Elira absorbed his words carefully, uncertain where this conversation was leading. "I only wanted to save Ash," she said honestly. "I never intended to become involved in anything beyond that." "I know," the king said, his sharp gaze softening slightly, "and that, I believe, is precisely why my son has grown so attached to you. You act from genuine conviction, without calculation or ambition, a rarity among those who typically find themselves close to this throne." Elira felt heat rise to her cheeks at the mention of Chaol's attachment, uncertain how to respond to the king's evident awareness of feelings she and Chaol had barely begun to fully acknowledge between themselves. The king studied her reaction with something close to a knowing smile, an expression she had not expected from a man whose reputation for fierce judgment preceded him so thoroughly. "My son has informed me of his intentions regarding you," the king said finally, watching her carefully for her reaction. "He wishes to formally acknowledge you as his intended companion, a bond recognized before the full court, should you choose to accept such a position." The weight of his words settled over Elira slowly, disbelief mixing with a cautious, growing hope she barely dared to fully acknowledge. "Your Majesty," she began carefully, "I'm a market vendor. I have no title, no lineage worth mentioning at court. Surely there are more suitable companions for someone of your son's position." "Suitability," the king said thoughtfully, "is often measured by the wrong standards. You saved a bloodline this kingdom believed lost forever. You faced down danger and deception with courage. I rarely witness even among trained soldiers. And you have earned my son's genuine affection, not through calculation or ambition, but through simple, unwavering integrity. I can think of no more suitable companion for the future of this throne." Elira sat in stunned silence, the weight of everything that had happened since that desperate night in the garden finally settling into place, culminating in a moment she could never have imagined when she first climbed over that wall with nothing but a dying pup and a desperate hope to guide her. Later that evening, she found Chaol waiting for her near the same fountain where their unlikely friendship had first taken root, Ash bounding ahead of her to greet him with his usual enthusiasm. Chaol's expression carried a nervous hope that mirrored her own uncertain excitement as she approached. "My father spoke with you," he said, watching her carefully. "He did," she confirmed, a smile breaking through despite her lingering disbelief. "He said you wish to formally acknowledge our bond before the court." "Only if that is what you want as well," Chaol said quickly, earnestness replacing the careful composure he so often maintained. "I never wish to make choices for you again. Not after everything my silence cost us both in the beginning." Elira closed the remaining distance between them, reaching up to gently touch his face, a gesture that felt both entirely new and completely natural after everything they had endured together. "I want this," she said softly, certainty settling warmly into her chest. "Not because you're a prince, and not because of everything that's happened since that night in the garden. I want this because somewhere along the way, without either of us fully realizing it, you became the person I trust most in this entire world." Chaol's answering smile was the warmest she had ever seen from him, free of guardedness, free of careful calculation, simply genuine joy shining openly in his eyes. He leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she chose, before pressing a gentle, tender kiss to her lips, one she met fully, without hesitation, Ash circling excitedly around their feet, as though sensing the significance of the moment. The formal ceremony took place several weeks later, the grand hall restored fully from the damage of House Voss's attack, filled now with nobility and common folk alike, drawn by curiosity and genuine celebration for the unlikely story that had captured the kingdom's attention. Elira stood beside Chaol before the assembled court, Ash sitting proudly between them, his royal collar gleaming as brightly as the joy shining in Elira's heart. The king himself presided over the ceremony, his earlier severity long since replaced by genuine warmth as he formally acknowledged Elira's place beside his son, sealing a bond that had begun, improbably, with a desperate theft in the dead of night, and had grown, through courage and honesty and unexpected trust, into something neither of them could have imagined when their paths first crossed beneath the moonlit roses of the royal garden. Vera stood proudly among the gathered crowd, tears of joy in her eyes as she watched the young woman she had helped guide through so much danger finally find her place in a world that had once seemed impossibly far beyond her reach. And Alira, looking out over the crowd, over the palace that had once terrified her, over the prince who had become her partner in every sense that mattered, felt only gratitude for the reckless, desperate choice that had changed the entire course of her life. She had stolen roses to save a dying pup, never imagining that single act of compassion would lead her to a love and a life more remarkable than anything she could have dreamed possible. And as Ash pressed contentedly against her side, finally home in every sense of the word, Alira understood that some risks, however dangerous they seemed in the moment, were always worth taking for the sake of a life worth saving.